1876.
This is Audible.
Listening library.
Of slave.
They had a dream. The civil rights struggle from Frederick Douglass to Marcus Garvey to Martin Luther King Jr. to Malcolm X. By Jules Archer. Read for you by Roscoe Orman.
The history of the black struggle in America. 1. Since ancient times, racial prejudice has been used to justify slavery. It was the justification in America when the first 20 Africans were imported into Virginia as bound servants in 1619. British writers defended slavery as the backbone and mainspring of British commerce, calling the kidnapped Africans ignoble savages. While slavery flourished openly in American colonies, the possibility of slave revolts was a constant fear. Many colonies forbade blacks to assemble, travel without permission, bear arms, or possess liquor. In Virginia, any master who killed his slave for resisting correction went free on the assumption he would not destroy his own valuable property without just cause. One of the earliest slave revolts took place in New York City in 1712. 8,000 whites owned 2,000 slaves, most of whom were cruelly treated. Gathering secretly after midnight, 23 slaves set fire to a house as a signal to the city's blacks that an uprising had begun. Armed with guns, long knives, and hatchets they had secured from drunken crews in port, they attacked whites, killing 9. The governor's soldiers routed and pursued them. Some trapped slaves turned guns and knives on themselves rather than be captured. 21 were executed. Some hanged, some tortured and broken on the wheel, some burned to death. This cycle of cruel treatment, revolt, and violent suppression would be repeated throughout slavery's existence in America. By 1760, almost 500,000 slaves were working on southern plantations. Thomas Jefferson himself was a slaveholder who saw no possibility that blacks and whites could ever live together as equals. In 1776, he warned that Americans would one day pay bitterly for having brought the black man to this continent in chains, and urged resettling slaves in Africa. His views underwent change 4 years later, however, when he advocated total emancipation. Some said the reason was his affair with a black slave and their 5 children. But 1801 was also when a slave insurrection broke out in Virginia, and some 35 black rebels were executed. A gloomy Jefferson prophesied, quote, "We are truly to be pitied. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just." End of quote. He sought to trouble the conscience of fellow Virginians by reminding them, quote, "One day of American slavery is worse than 1,000 years of what we rose in arms to oppose." End of quote. At Jefferson's insistence, Congress passed the act to prohibit the importation of slaves after 1808. This law, however, did not stop an illegal slave traffic. It continued to flourish until the Civil War, earning fat profits for northern ship owners. Slavery also earned huge profits for southern plantation owners, thanks to Eli Whitney's cotton gin, invented in 1793. With the problem of processing the plant solved, the cotton industry grew rapidly, as did the need for slave field hands on the plantations. Significantly, 1793 was also the year Congress passed the first fugitive slave law, levying a $500 fine on anyone attempting to conceal or rescue an escaped slave. But this did nothing to stop slaves' resistance. By 1820, there had been over 250 slave revolts. The largest occurred in 1811, when a slave named Charles led 500 slaves in a revolt at the Andre Sugar Plantation north of New Orleans. After wounding Andre and killing his son, they seized arms and advanced down the coast, smashing and looting property. Terrified whites fled before them. In a battle with several hundred U.S. troops and militia, 83 slaves were killed. 16 were arrested, tried, and executed. Their heads were mounted on poles at intervals along the Mississippi River as a grim warning to all restless slaves. 2. There was now growing support in the North for solving the black problem by resettling free blacks in African colonies. Paul Cuffey, a Boston Quaker, took one shipload of black passengers to settle in Sierra Leone. In 1816, the American Colonization Society, ACS, was founded to promote the plan, in the belief that blacks were a troublesome minority, best gotten rid of. Prominent members included James Madison, Andrew Jackson, Daniel Webster, Stephen Douglas, and James Monroe. Congress supported the ACS, authorizing money to transport 20,000 free blacks to establish an African colony, which became Liberia. By 1819, there was an even balance between northern states that barred slavery and southern states that depended on it. As the friction between them grew more intense, a northern abolitionist movement sprang up. Abolitionists created what was called the Underground Railroad, an escape route to Canada for runaway slaves. Escapees were hunted by slave catchers, who were paid bounties for each runaway captured. Despite these dangers, as many as 20,000 slaves escaped on the Underground Railroad before the Civil War. Some returned to the South to serve as guides for other escapees. The most famous of these was Harriet Tubman, who carried a $10,000 bounty for her capture, dead or alive. Meanwhile, the slave revolts continued. In 1822, an informer revealed a plot by a free Haitian black, Denmark Vesey, to lead an uprising of all blacks in South Carolina. The plot was quickly crushed, and 37 blacks were executed. A black Boston ragman, David Walker, published a pamphlet called Walker's Appeal in 1830, calling upon all Southern slaves to revolt. Copies found their way below the Mason-Dixon line, the informal boundary between slave and free states, leading Southern port police to search ships for the incendiary pamphlet. Any black seaman found with one was jailed and flogged. 1 year later, fresh panic swept the South. Nat Turner, a 31-year-old Virginia slave, had awed fellow slaves with his report of hearing, quote, a loud noise in the heavens, end of quote, followed by the appearance of a spirit who revealed that he had been chosen by God to lead the slaves out of bondage. With his disciples, Turner plotted a swift and terrible massacre that would terrify whites into fleeing before them. He and 5 slaves murdered their sleeping master, his wife, and 3 children. Seizing guns and ammunition, they sped from plantation to plantation, gathering 64 more recruits. In each house the mob burst into, they assassinated all white occupants and seized muskets, axes, scythes, swords, and clubs. In 2 days, over 57 white men, women, and children were slain in a 20-mile area. Word flashed around the countryside, then all through the South. The slaves are plotting. The Negroes have risen. Military forces swept through the country, killing over 100 slaves indiscriminately in a vengeful massacre. Many of Turner's followers were captured and killed on the spot. Some were decapitated. 19 were tried and executed. Nat Turner was hanged. Turner's rebellion sent shivers up and down the spines of all Southerners. Quote, it is like a smothered volcano, end of quote. quavered Mrs. Lawrence Lewis, George Washington's niece. Quote, "We know not when or where the flame will burst forth, but we know that death in the most repulsive form awaits us." End of quote. Infuriated slave owners blamed David Walker's pamphlet and the agitation of the North's most militant and active abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison had begun publishing an abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831. In the following year, he organized the New England Anti-Slavery Society, NEASS, with a merchant colleague, Louis Tappan. Through his paper and the NEASS, Garrison not only condemned the Southern system of slavery, but he also accused New Englanders of hypocrisy for professing to oppose slavery while using products produced by the slave states. Garrison demanded in his paper that Northerners boycott slave-produced products, but many Northern businessmen had investments in Southern plantations or traded with them. One New York businessman told abolitionist minister Samuel J. May, quote, "It is a matter of business necessity. We cannot afford to let you succeed." End of quote. Some Northern newspapers denounced the abolitionists for holding integrated meetings and accused them of fostering intermarriage. Northern racist mobs staged pro-slavery riots during the summer of 1834 in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Ohio, and Michigan. Garrison himself received hundreds of letters threatening his life. When he tried to speak at the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1835, he was seized by a mob and led through the streets by a rope around his neck. He had to be rescued by burly truckers sent to his aid by Boston's mayor. In the South, meanwhile, slave owner brutality grew increasingly savage. In Tennessee, a slave who had fought back and killed a cruel master was burned alive over a slow fire before a crowd of thousands. One minister criticized the punishment. He would have preferred the slave to be torn to pieces with red-hot pincers. "This," Garrison asked in horror, "is a man of God?" Garrison was joined in his abolitionist crusade by escaped slave Frederick Douglass, who moved audiences with his own story of suffering at the hands of cruel slave masters. While rallying the conscience of white Americans with Garrison, Douglass also encouraged free blacks to enter the political struggle against slavery through his newspaper, The North Star. Throughout the Civil War and the fight for black freedom that followed, Douglass would be the leading black spokesman for racial equality. 3. The westward expansion of America intensified the struggle between North and South over the political balance of slave and free states. Congress stirred a Northern furor by passing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, providing federal aid in apprehending runaways and punishing anyone hindering their recapture, whether they were in a free territory or not. That fury was seen in full force in 1854, when Anthony Burns, a runaway slave from Virginia, was arrested in Boston on a fugitive slave warrant. Outraged abolitionists aroused a crowd of 50,000 to attempt an unsuccessful rescue of Burns from his prison cell. It took 1,000 soldiers and police with drawn guns to force the prisoner aboard a ship sailing for Virginia. Like Congress, the Supreme Court took a dim view of the rights of all blacks. In the Dred Scott decision of 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney declared that no slave or descendant could be a U.S. citizen, and Congress had no right to prohibit slavery in the territories because it deprived Southerners of slave property without due process of law. With the presidential election of 1860 approaching, slavery was a much-debated issue. But there was basic agreement between the two candidates for the Republican nomination. Both Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln favored the forced emigration of blacks. Lincoln also believed that blacks were mentally and morally inferior to whites, and conceded to Douglas that federal power should not infringe upon states' rights to slavery. Lincoln was nominated by the Republicans in May 1860 under voting rules that allowed free blacks to vote in only 5 northern states. Abolitionist Wendell Phillips responded with a slashing editorial in Garrison's Liberator, assailing him as, quote, "the slave hound of Illinois," end of quote. When the Civil War broke out on April 12, 1861, after Lincoln's election, many whites in northern and border states angrily blamed blacks in their midst. As law enforcement officials looked the other way, white mobs attacked black communities in Memphis, Louisville, Cincinnati, and Detroit. To pacify whites in the border states, the Union Army was given strict orders not to interfere with slavery there. At first, the Union Army refused to enlist free blacks. Eventually, however, 156,000 black troops were accepted. Fighting 39 major battles, they earned Congressional Medals of Honor, despite treatment inferior to that accorded white troops. Lincoln was fearful that millions of Northerners who were fighting and financing a war to hold the Union together would balk at doing so to abolish slavery. Emancipation, he worried, would also drive the border states into the arms of the South. He stated, quote, "My paramount object is to save the Union, and not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it." End of quote. Finally, however, he felt reluctantly driven to issue the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. Even then, it was more a war strategy than a moral document. It only freed slaves in the Confederacy in the hopes that they would desert southern plantations for Union lines. Slaves in border states or in southern areas under Union